He sat right over there on a gray guardrail in the direct and honest midday sunlight, and his worn and worked hands held a cardboard sign that said, "We'll work for food," in bold black letters. I was still a child, around 10, and my first reaction at seeing a homeless man was to look away from him. For me, not seeing a problem meant that I could believe there wasn't a problem. And now that I'm a little older and a little more observant, I see that this is still far too common a reaction. And the strategy of not looking, not seeing a problem, it worked, for a time at least. And what also worked to stave away the pain and the guilt at seeing another human being suffer while doing nothing on my part was simply distance. And it wasn't just a physical distance, though that did help. I distanced myself by somehow convincing myself that the homeless were another species, and I put them into these neat little boxes of assumptions and stereotypes, and this is easier, this is safer for me to do. And again, for a time, this worked. But then that time of blissful ignorance and arrogance came to a crashing halt. It was a day that I'll remember for the rest of my life. 4 girlfriends and I had just come back from First Friday and exploring downtown Raleigh, and we're on our way back to our car. And as we were making our way, we passed a homeless man sitting on the sidewalk. And as I passed him, I felt the familiar, don't look, just keep walking. And as I passed him, I felt a little bit of relief. But just as that relief was washing over me, one of my friends, Crystal, stopped and spoke into the night. Wait, that was a living person we just passed. So she turned right around and she walked up to the man while I and my friends kind of hung back, sort of uneasy tension in the air. And Crystal walked up to the man and she asked for money to buy food, but she didn't have any money, so she offered instead an orange and granola bar that she had. But the man insisted on money, and having none, she said goodnight and returned to our group. And as we were walking back to our car, I knew that one instant, in the cool evening air, that something had changed. Why did I look away from or ignore the homeless? Why does most of society look away from or ignore the homeless? Did I really believe I was somehow better than these men, women, children who had to live on the streets or in shelters? Oh, dear God, did I just not care? But I mean, why should I care? It wasn't my fault these people had to live on the streets. I mean, they could each live the American dream and pull themselves up by their bootstraps and rise out of homelessness, right? Wrong. Oh, how wrong and misguided. So I started spending time at Moore Square downtown, a place many of you may be familiar with Crystal. And we got a few curious stares at first. Why were we out there talking to people? Why were we talking to the homeless? And one of the first men that I met, Charles, asked me, was I out there for a project, for a class? What was I doing? And I told him no. This is exactly where I wanted to be. So after a while, Charles and another man, Todd, that he was with, started opening up about themselves. And the stories that they told were not the stories I had assigned to every homeless person. They worked when they could. They weren't into drugs, and they didn't have a mental illness. And the more homeless people that I got to talk to, that I got to hear stories from, the more I realized just how gray it all was. There's not just one face to the homeless. I did meet people who suffered from mental illness, but I met people who were wise and who were kind and who were gentle. And I did meet people who were into drugs and who didn't have the best of intentions. But I met even more people who were welcoming and who wanted to teach me hard life lessons that they had learned to spare me, a stranger they had just met, the difficulty. One of the more important things that I realized is that the homeless, this other species that I'd come up with in my mind, their mothers, their fathers, their sisters and sons and friends and lovers and dreamers, just like everyone else I'd met. I met one man who called himself the Colonel because he watched over the community at Moore Square. And the Colonel lived in his truck himself, but he also came to Moore Square to spend time with the community, to hand out food. And that one afternoon, I was one of them. And so we shared turkey sandwiches, and we got to know one another a little better. And I learned how to play craps. So the Colonel is a tall, kind, white, older man with silver hair who lives in his truck himself, but who also hands out food and who took the time to get to know a college student. And I think, how exactly is that different from anyone else? There's just so much gray area. So why do we think the way we do? Why do we do the things that we do? There are 3 ideas that help us to understand our actions a little bit better, and they are the minimal group paradigm, Outgroup Homogeneity Effect, and Illusory Correlation. So imagine you are on a playground and you see 5 little girls who are wearing blue shirts and they all have ponytails up. And a little boy and another little girl come up and they want to turn on the swing sets too, but the 5 little girls keep switching swings with one another and just aren't willing to accept these outsiders. Hopefully we don't hoard swings today, but we still exhibit this sort of behavior to some extent. And this is the minimal group paradigm in which we see a distinction between groups. It's having this us-them mentality, and we show favoritism for members that are like us, members within our own groups. And this is a normal human tendency. It helps us to assign order and structure to our lives, and it helps us to build bonds with people that are most like us. But while we build bonds with some, we also build walls and divides against those that are most unlike us, the them that can teach us the most. So that's minimal group paradigm. I remember when I was younger being told that I shouldn't hand out money to the homeless because they don't work, they don't deserve it. They would just use it to buy drugs and alcohol anyway. And this reassurance from an adult helped me to feel a little less guilty about not helping the homeless. I mean, of course I didn't want to support laziness or bad habits. But now I see that this gross generalization that every homeless person is the same is simply wrong. It's almost like saying, oh, all Asians are the same. They all love rice and are super good at math. Okay, well, I actually do really like rice, but I am not a math genius by any standards. But this is Outgroup Homogeneity Effect, and it's believing that members of an in-group, a group that you include yourself in, so say your friend group, your culture, your society, you're all unique individuals, and you share many of the same characteristics, but you're each your own person. And that people of an out-group, so people that are outside of your own group, a certain group outside of your own group, they're all the same. They all think and act and dress the same. And so this statement that all the homeless are lazy and will use their money on drugs and alcohol sounds really harsh, and it's not true. But if we think about how often we interact with the homeless, weekly if we volunteer, occasionally if you pass someone on Hillsborough Street, never, where do our ideas of who the homeless are come from? They can come from the media, from secondhand stories, from our own limited experiences. And we each have heard different stories, and we each have different experiences. But we can see how it's difficult to make a generalization about a group of people we don't know very much about. And we can start understanding where our own perspectives are coming from. So we've looked at minimal group paradigm and outgroup homogeneity effect. Let's look at one more. Distinctive events capture our attention. They stick out in our minds. So let's imagine that we hear that clowns have been responsible for a car accident. Okay, so now I'm thinking, in addition to being terrifying, clowns are terrible drivers. But car wrecks themselves are not that uncommon, and they can happen to anyone. But if we take this combination of a minority group, clowns, and add it with this negative event, the car wreck, it can lead to this event being doubly memorable, and it sticks out in our mind. It's something unique, and we can recall it easily, and it can start becoming overrepresented in our lives. And so this is illusory correlation, and it's seeing correlations between events or characteristics that aren't actually related. So if we apply this train of thought to what's seen or heard about the homeless, in my experience, there's more negative exposure than there is positive. And so maybe it's easier to recall negative memories about the homeless population. But in reality, these negative associations and the homeless aren't really related. Just one more quick example is thinking, okay, more crime happens during a full moon. People just get the crazy eyes. But if we look at the number of crimes that happen on a full moon night versus any other night during the month, we would see that it's not necessarily true that all the crime happens on this one night during a full moon. But it's unique and it sticks out in your mind, and very bizarre. But it can lead us to think that this event is true when in reality it's not. We think it's overrepresented in our minds. And so these three ideas, minimal group paradigm, outgroup homogeneity effect, and illusory correlation, you guys are going to have this down pat by the end of this. They're these kind of long, complicated names and theories, but they really help us to understand why we put distance and divides up when we walk past a person on the street. And honestly, we don't just do this with the homeless population. We do this with people we've never met before. We do this with our coworkers, our classmates, even our friends sometimes. And it can be easy to put people into these neat little boxes and assign a black and white story to them than it is to be vulnerable, to hear someone's story that can shatter that black and white world. That man on the gray guardrail in the direct and honest midday sunlight is a father of two who lost his job and is just trying his best to get by now. I asked you earlier why it was important, why we should even care about breaking barriers, breaking down our stereotypes. We each put up our own barriers against other people, but we each have our own barriers to overcome, whether it's age or gender or race or physical ability. And we all judge, and we all are judged by the stereotypes that we ourselves get labeled with. Imagine what it would be like if we were just a little less quick to judge, a little less judgmental, a little more willing to be empathetic and kind and understanding towards one another. I have a friend from Governor's School who shared last summer an experience of her offering just a bit of kindness to a homeless man she had just met. And after hearing his story, getting to know him, she let her assumptions go that she had earlier. And she wanted other people to be able to do the same thing. Just take a minute to listen to a story and to let go of your assumptions, what you thought you knew from before. The proverb goes, be kind, for everyone you meet is fighting a great fight. My intention here today is not to convince you to spend time with the homeless or to befriend every stranger that you meet. But I would say try if you get the chance. Offer to buy lunch and have lunch with a homeless person if the opportunity arises. Get to know that classmate or the coworker that you've never spoken to before. Ask your best friend what their life was like growing up. You never know what you'll learn. You never know where it could lead. No, my challenge is not for you to end homelessness, and it's not to change the world. But I do ask something even more daunting. Ask that you change your world and how you see and interact with it and the fellow human being that you share it with. I started breaking down my barriers and stereotypes with the homeless community. And that led to me being able to break down my barriers and stereotypes in other relationships in my life. But maybe that's not where you'll start. Maybe that's a big step. Maybe you'll start with challenging what you know or what you think you know about a certain culture. Asians, with a gender, with a certain age group. What's important is that you start. And even more importantly than that is that you know you can start. You have that ability. Gandhi said to be the change in the world that you wish to see. Will you be brave enough to start your own journey of change? Thank you.